On Monday, December 3rd, the agency celebrated its 20th anniversary in Washington with several special events. The day began with a lively panel discussion featuring 3 former administrators at Arena Stage across from our Waterside Mall headquarters. It was a rare opportunity to hear from so many of those who led our agency during its first 20 years. First, we'll show you some excerpts from their conversation. Then we'll see some highlights from the combined Anniversary and Awards program at Constitution Hall. Now, let's join the panel discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the 20th birthday party of the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's a very special day. I am Julie Balaga. I'm the Regional Administrator of the EPA, Region 1 in Boston. This is a wonderful opportunity for us. So today we can reflect back on what's happened over the last 20 years and take a look at where we really ought to go for the future. We have an extraordinary, talented group of panelists here, but go with me for a minute. Just take a minute and put your hat back, thinking 20 years ago what it was like in this country. We had raw sewage going out into our waterways. We had rivers bursting into flame. We had cities that were enshrouded in pollution. We had automobiles that were emitting 10 times what they are emitting today. We were disposing of our waste, our hazardous waste, our solid waste, any place. If it was out of sight, it was out of mind, and we thought that was terrific. But the truth is the public didn't. The public were alarmed. In the spring of that year, we had Earth Day. And then by the fall of that year, things began to fall into place. And then we had that very historic day. It was December 2nd, 1970, and the EPA became a reality, a wonderful reality. Now, here we are 20 years later. It's a time to evaluate, a time to celebrate, and a time to plan. It is a delight to have this extraordinary group with us this morning. These are leaders, environmental policymakers, par excellence. So let me throw out a question to you. Let's get the ball rolling. What do you consider your single most important accomplishment during your term, and why? And don't laugh.
I think the first time you mentioned the whole litany of things that led to the creation of EPA in the first place. I mean, we really had gross pollution problems in those days, and there was a necessity for the government at the time to show that it was serious about dealing with pollution problems, that the federal government was willing to step in where obviously the almost total delegation to the states and local governments up prior to 1970 hadn't gotten the job done, and where the federal government was willing to step in, set some standards, begin to enforce them, and then redelegate it back to the states with a strong oversight from the federal government, establishing that framework, convincing, I think, any fair-minded person that the government was serious about it was a necessary thing to do in the early days of the agency, and I think we accomplished that. The second time, essentially, it was restoring morale, and I think that happened as much because of the inherent buoyancy of the people at EPA as my return, but that also was, I think, something I feel proud of.
I think really the key thing during my time, I came in mid-1973, was the oil embargo, the Arab oil embargo, and the bloom was sort of off the environmental rose at that time, and energy was it. And during my entire time, it was the environmental energy conflict, if you will, in terms of policy within the administration, in the Congress, that was pretty crucial. And I think the major EPA accomplishment of those years was to keep our programs on track. And we never had to really accommodate in any undesirable way with the energy crunch.
Sounds good to me. Who else wants to grab it? Gus, you want to talk about the Carter days?
Well, let me say how sad Doug is for not being able to be here. He's out of the country, and wanted me to express that very strongly. I think that both he and I feel that the critical thing that happened during those years when he was here, or a critical thing, was that was the point in history in which this legacy of toxic chemicals and hazardous waste that we've built up in the country really came home to roost. and it was the period of Love Canal, the Toxic Substance Control Act, and the hazardous waste management legislation had just been passed by the Congress and had to be implemented. Shortly thereafter, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was amended to pick up and thoroughly address the toxics question. And all during this time, there were exposures of exposés, really, of accumulated hazardous waste problems around the country, which led to the passage of the Superfund legislation at the very end of the administration. So there were 4 years in which I think that EPA really turned itself and addressed in an authoritative way this legacy, tragic legacy of hazardous waste in the country. And I think that's one of the things that Doug is proudest of, is having moved the agency strongly to focus on the public health implications and the groundwater implications and other implications of this tragic legacy.
Wonderful. Lee, you're on.
Well, there were a number of things I guess I recall, but one that stands out to me was concluding the Montreal Protocol as a treaty that dealt with an extraordinarily significant environmental issue, but also a treaty that I think established a framework for dealing with international environmental concerns, and one that I think will serve as a model for other problems we've got to deal with.
And today, Bill?
The Clean Air Act obviously has to stand very high on the list of things that I think we will be proud of and will stand the test of time. It was a time when we dealt with very high expectations. When we crafted a law, a lot of the ideas had been in the agency, were conceptually developed in the agency. They were successfully integrated with the views of other agencies and coordinated very closely with the White House. And that bill was our bill, the bill that finally passed. It's an innovative bill. It makes a start towards, I think, really integrating our economic expectations with our environmental aspirations. It has important incentives to early compliance, to market directions, and to clean fuels, and I think is very important.
Well, it gives me a chance then to go to some of the questions that we got from members of the audience, and this is a natural, and actually it's addressed to you, Russ, but I think anybody could deal with it because it talks about the developing nations. What role should the EPA play in providing technical assistance to developing nations? Have you got a particular...
I think I've already touched on this. I think EPA is looked to around the world as being the principal source of technical help in the environmental area, and I think the agency and this country, working through EPA, has the responsibility to respond to that need. And I think that clearly EPA has a tremendous both opportunity and responsibility for providing technical assistance to, call it the third world or whatever, in the international arena.
The demands on us in this area are off the scale. I think of some of the most effective work we've done. We worked with the Chinese to try to get them not to commit to bringing on 300 million new refrigerators that would have chlorofluorocarbons, but rather would be designed to use their substitutes. That was a successful visit by an EPA team. We assessed the cost of transferring out of these CFCs in Brazil and in Mexico and other countries. And that laid the groundwork for some of those countries actually ratifying the protocol. We don't yet, however, have anything like the resources. We certainly don't have the statutory directive to give proper attention to this area.
But there was a lot of technical assistance and transfer going on early on in EPA. And it's been kind of a history of the agency, and a very constructive one, I think.
And I think along the lines of Russ's point about the future role that EPA will play globally, just from a practical point of view, not only is it going to be absolutely required, I believe, for the U.S. to be out front on technical assistance and technology transfer, I think it's going to be essential if you expect those developing countries to come in and participate and be signatories to international agreements, which is going to be necessary for you to show that indeed you're willing and prepared to provide them assistance as they try to comply.
It's another one that really looks like I wrote it, but honestly, I really didn't. It says, many believe that the regions are where things are really happening. What observations do you have about the distinct historical contribution of regional employees? It was even typed, I promise I didn't write it. How did the, Bill, it might be interesting actually for you to tell us a little bit about it, because EPA is very different in terms of its regional phenomenon and the authority at the regional level, and you were very instrumental in making that happen.
Well, it was a coincidence in some respects that EPA was created just at the time an idea of having regional centers for government agencies was in full flower here in Washington. And we had separate regions for air, water, solid waste throughout the country. I mean, they are all overlapping. So we took the 10 regions as they're currently formed and provided very strong delegations of authority, responsibility to those regional officials. In fact, when Russ took over, he asked me what kind of a monster I'd given him with all the regional administrators out there dictating what went on. But it was consciously done, and it was done because of the diversity of the country, of the fact that the problems differed in different parts of the country. The response to them was going to be more effective if there were people living right there who understood the culture of that part of the country and the kinds of things that would trigger a positive response in terms of the mission of the agency to alleviate pollution and other objectives. So I think that the original idea was sound. I believe it's still sound. And that the unfortunate thing about it is that EPA really has a lot more authority and autonomy in the field than just about any other agency in government. And it makes it difficult sometimes for the EPA regional administrator to function with their counterparts because they don't have the authority to make the kinds of judgments that the regional administrators do. But still, I think that's the way the rest of the government ought to go, and EPA ought not to back up.
Let's go to another question that I know interests a lot of particularly EPA personnel here. There's a recent study done by the Science Advisory Board at Bill Riley's request. It's a really interesting report, and it's called Reducing Risk. And in that report, it reaffirms what a lot of us at the EPA are aware of, that priorities of this agency tend to be set by Congress and public perception of a risk, and not by the science of risk. And I'd like to throw out to you, and I assume you've all had a chance to look at it, what do you think can be done? Is it possible to achieve a reordering of our priorities? Is it politically possible? Is it a real world assignment? Let's start today and move back. Bill?
The agency has an opportunity to take a great deal of initiative now. I think that it is up to us to define the problems and then communicate to the Congress without in any way expecting that they'll necessarily do what we think is most important, or in every case should. They're responding to the country after all, and it's quite clear where the country considers the most serious problems and risks. Our job to continue to implement those programs, but to constantly remind the country and the rest of the world of some of the unattended to problems. That I take to be the burden of that report.
Now, if you assume some limit of resources that the society is going to spend on reducing risk, and the agency has, through a series of very careful studies, decided here are the kinds of priorities we ought to be directing those resources toward, then the agency has an educational role, which is a very important one to discharge, more than an advocacy role, educating that public that is ultimately going to make the demands on Congress that will translate into the kind of authorities that you need in order to be effective in addressing the higher priority risk. That I think is really a crucial distinction between the agency today and when it started 20 years ago.
Thank you all for sharing your wisdom with us. I thank the audience for coming. Let's hope that the next 20 years is as productive as the past 20 years. And I will end by saying, happy birthday, EPA. Happy birthday. Thank you.
And now on to Constitution Hall for our combined anniversary celebration and awards program. Here are some highlights from that event.
Welcome again to this happy occasion. My name is Hank Habich. I'm your Deputy Administrator, and I'm honored to be your Master of Ceremonies for this afternoon's festivities. There are so many friends and VIPs to recognize. Obviously, I can't go through the entire list, but there are several specific acknowledgments I want to make of VIPs who are with us today. The first two are two great friends and former EPA administrators who gave us some outstanding thoughts here this morning, sitting over here in the box seats. The first one is one of the true, can really be counted as one of the true statesmen in the world for conservation. And the second, who was Bill Riley's most recent predecessor, has a combination of vision and mastery of detail that I think has already become legendary at the agency. Please welcome Russ Train and Lee Thomas. Sitting with Russ and Lee is the First Lady of EPA, a good friend and a truly classy friend of the agency, Libby Riley. We have many distinguished people here, many distinguished alumni from EPA, former deputy administrators, assistant administrators, regional administrators, environmental leaders. We have Mike DeLand here, distinguished EPA alumnus and now chairman of the President's Council on Environmental Quality. Thank you for coming, Mike. As I say, I can't name them all, but we have VIPs around the hall, representatives from other federal agencies, NOAA, Congress and congressional staff. We also have here in the middle of the hall our charter employees. As Bill Ruckelshaus said, and Bill Riley and I were quite impressed to know that some 20% of our original charter employees are still with the agency, and we all know well that they've been around since the beginning, and they're also some of the best sources of new ideas and new approaches at the agency. And finally, sitting here in the front rows, here in front of us here is EPA's current leadership, our assistant administrators, regional administrators, the very important deputies group, who are all helping to build on the proud tradition that we're all aware of and that Bill Ruckelshaus talked about. You know, we've all seen the public opinion polls that indicate a great distrust of a number of particular groups, a great distrust of politicians, great distrust of businessmen, great distrust of government officials, I might also add lawyers. Well, here's a man who represents every one of those groups. Please join me in welcoming back Bill Ruckelshaus.
Nothing in my life will ever give me greater pride than having twice been privileged to serve with the people of EPA. When I returned to EPA in 1983, I made a tour of all 10 regions. At each stop, we had an all-hands meeting, and I would ask those present who had been present at the creation of EPA to stand up. In some regions, as many as 2/3 of the people present would stand. On those visits, and in reading this program here today, by the way, I noticed there are something like 1,200 people still here in the agency who were here when we started 20 years ago. On those visits and being with you here this afternoon, it strikes me with great force what a tremendous debt of gratitude our country owes to the dedicated people of EPA. Your work is tough, demanding, and relentless. The decisions made are difficult and most often satisfy no one, and the problems never seem to go away, which is why all of you must stay everlastingly at them. And your mission is the highest. In a sense, it transcends all others. Your mission is the preservation of life itself. Thank God you're doing what you're doing, and thank you for the honor of having twice served with you. Thank you very much.
Well, it was a great opportunity for us to combine this celebration with a recognition of the kind of talent and quality that we have at the agency. And we want to begin to start recognizing the dedicated and talented people who've distinguished themselves over the past year and the past few years as EPA employees. In the end, after all, EPA's success and our public image are defined by our people. In Process is an a cappella singing group of African-American women who come from various professions and backgrounds. They look to the oral traditions and religious roots of our culture as they sing about women and about freedom. Please welcome In Process.
Any way you can make it, baby, you keep on moving it on. Any way you can make it, baby, you keep on moving it on. Any way you can make it, baby, you keep on moving it on. Any way you can make it, baby, you keep on moving it on. If you can't fly.
Without further ado, let me turn it over to the person I think ideally suited to build on the best of the traditions we've celebrated here today, but also to encourage the kind of new ideas we need to help us be leaders into the next century, our Administrator, Bill Riley.
I wish all of you from around the country, all 17,000 of the regional and field offices and in the labs, could be together today. Imagine an all-hands meeting, 17,000 strong. On the 20th anniversary of the agency, I want to thank all of you for contributing so much to our success, for helping to lay the groundwork for what promises to be an even more exciting future. The challenges we face are no less daunting and certainly no less complex than those faced by the people who launched EPA on its critically important mission 20 years ago. What lies ahead for us? In the broadest sense, I think we're challenged by three great overriding needs. The first need is to stabilize and protect the life support systems of the planet itself. I was struck in opening the Budapest Center on the regional environment of Eastern and Central Europe how great is the confidence and how high the expectations of EPA in other parts of the world plagued by severe environmental problems. I've said, in fact, to some degree our stature seems almost to rise directly with distance from Washington. But it's almost scary how much the rest of the world looks to the ideas, the research, the science, the public policy innovations and experiments of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. EPA has been the leading agency developing the international policy for protecting upper atmospheric ozone and testing substitutes for CFCs and regulating the phase-out of CFCs. On that and so many other issues, we will continue to define our mission in global dimensions. The second great need is to restore and protect the natural systems of the United States. The wetlands and groundwater, the bays and sounds and lakes, the soils and fish, the biotic platform on which all activity, including economic activity, depends. Just as in the past, our successes in this effort will be a beacon to the whole world, so desperately in need of examples of success. Included herewith is an increasingly rigorous sensitivity to all of the threats that plague and threaten the public health of the people of this country and increasingly of other countries. The third great challenge is to help to usher in a new era of integration that I believe is both necessary and also possible, perhaps for the first time in modern American history, integration between the nation's economic goals and its environmental aspirations. Ours is a job that must be done if we, this generation, our children, generations to come, are to enjoy a future worthy of the name. That fundamentally is really why I'm at EPA. It's why you're at EPA. Together, let's make the next 20 years even more productive, more successful, more rewarding than the past 20. Thanks very much. Happy birthday, EPA.
Pride in the progress of 2 decades. Yet many unsolved problems still remain today. We can make a difference, for the future is in our hands. Let's all join together for the third decade just ahead. Let's all join together for the third decade just ahead. Happy anniversary, happy birthday, EPA. Happy anniversary, happy birthday, EPA.
From all your fellow workers at EPA in Washington and across the country, happy anniversary.